Welcome everybody to this lesson. In this lesson, we are going to be talking about the CSS position property and the overflow property. And so the position property specifies the type of positioning method used by an element, right? And there are a couple of values that we are going to be looking at once we go into the code section. The first one is the static value. Then we're going to be looking at the relative value. Then we'll be looking at the fixed value, absolute value, and finally the sticky value. And then we're also going to be going all the way to look at what the overflow property does. And generally speaking, the overflow property controls what happens to content that is too big to fit into an area. Okay, so it's going to be specifying whether to clip the content or to add scroll bars. So we'll be looking at all that in the code section. So this is the HTML that we are going to be using for the first value that we are going to be looking at, which is static, right? Position static. And I haven't added any styling to it yet, right? And so you can see, and the only thing I have in here is a div with some content in there. So the position uh, uh, the position static element, position with value static, is is the position that is set by default. So elements are positioned as static by default, right? And static positioned elements are not affected by the top, bottom, left, and right properties, right? So these static positioned elements are not affected by those properties. Okay, so an element with position that is static is not positioned in any special way. It's always positioned according to the normal flow of the page, and we're going to take a look at that. So look at this example here with the div with this content, and then we are going to style this. Okay, and I am going to style the div. Maybe I should let me put a class name here so I can easily refer to this. Okay, so I'm going to call this static. Okay, so then noun, I can now call div dot static, right? And then I can style this. Okay, so the position is going to be static, right? And just for readability, I'm going to add a border to this. So 3 pixel, solid, and black. Okay, so when I refresh this, you can see that the default, that's what it was. Nothing really changed about this because that's the default. Okay, every element comes as position static by default. The next one that we are going to be looking at is relative position. And I'm going to copy this and paste it so that we have something to compare with. I'm just going to break out of this to create an extra line. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this relative. Right. And let me create the styling for this before I talk a little bit about it. Okay, so what happens with um the position uh, relative, which is the relative value that is set for the position, is that it's positioned relative to its normal position, right? So the normal position of this div is as it is, like default, right? Now we use the top, left, right, bottom properties to position it relative to the normal default position. So if you wanted this to be positioned a little bit left of this, or top of this or whatever, you can use those properties to shift and move this div around, and every other element would be adjusted to fit into any gap left by the element. So if there is an element that can fit into that gap, it's gonna fit. So we are gonna look at how that works. So if I just refresh this, nothing happens because it's just an empty style, right? So I'm gonna add position, and I'm gonna set relative. Okay, and if I just refresh this, still you're not going to see, nothing is going to happen because you have said it's going to be a relative position, but you haven't told it relative to the default what is the change that you want to see, right? Like you have to say relative to the default, I want it to shift left or top or right or bottom, right? So we are yet to do that. So right now I can say left 30 pixel. Right. So if I just refresh this, you can see that left 30 pixel, right? Relative to the original, which is something like this, you want a 30 pixel on the left. Good. And just for completeness, again, I'm going to add a border right here, a 3 pixel, solid green. Okay. Right. So if I refresh this, you can see what we were talking about. So that is the relative value, and that's how to set it. The next one is position fixed, right? So an element with position fixed is always positioned relative to the viewport, which actually means that it always stays in the same place uh, all the time, even if the page is scrolled, whether you scroll up or down or right or left, it always stays in the same position, right? So, and it doesn't leave any gap in the page where it would have normally been located. So it's just fixed, right? So let us just do another example, and I'm gonna copy and paste this. Good. And now this is fixed. Okie dokie. And so let me just refresh this so you see. And now I can add the style div dot fixed. And I'm gonna say position, and the value is fixed, right? And because it's fixed, you need to provide uh, a fixed position. So I'm gonna say bottom 0, right 0, and I'm gonna give it a width of 300 pixels and a border. So I'm gonna say 3 pixel, solid, and red. And so now when I refresh this, you can see now that uh, the position is fixed, meaning it's not gonna change whether we scroll or not. So even if I scroll, I'm scrolling from right to left, you see that the position is static. And now I have given it a position saying that the bottom at the position 0, and then on the right on position 0. So that gives it the corner, the edge, the bottom right corner, right? And then I say, okay, give it a width of 300, and maybe I can even increase this to 600. I'll just increase this to 600, right? So that is it, and then I gave it a border. So that is the fixed position implementation. So the next one that we are going to be looking at is the position absolute. Yep. So an element with position absolute is positioned relative to the nearest positioned ancestor, right? So instead of using the viewport like the fixed, right, it's gonna be using the nearest ancestor, right? So and if it doesn't have any ancestor, it's gonna be using the document body and it moves along with page scrolling. So we're gonna take a look at that. So in here, right, I'm gonna create a div within this relative div, right? And the reason why I want to create that is because I want this to have an ancestor, which should be this div class, which is relative, right? So in this div, I'm just gonna put in there this is uh, uh, absolute div. Okay, something like this, right? And maybe I can add some lorem to this. Okay, so I'm gonna give this a class and I'm gonna call this absolute. Great. Now when I refresh this, you can see the text. This is all in the main div, but I'm gonna style this differently. Okay, so I have my div dot absolute, and then in here I'm gonna put my position as absolute, right? And so it's going to be relative because it's absolute, it's going to be relative to the nearest ancestor, which is this div, and which is relative, right? So now I can now say relative to this, give me a position. So I need a top of 80 pixel, a right of 0, a width of say 200 pixel, a height of 100 pixel, and let's add a border so we can see. And then we have a border of 3 pixel solid uh, blue. Okay, so when I refresh this, now you can see right here, and you can see right now that it doesn't encapsulate it properly. So what I can do is I can just increase the width to say 400, refresh this, and it's encapsulated. Okay, so because this is absolute, right? It is positioned relative to the nearest ancestor, right? And the nearest ancestor is the is this div, which is the relative, this div class relative. So I'm saying that position it absolute relative to this div, and give it a top from this relative ancestor 80 pixels, give me a right of 0, and give me a width and a height of 100 and 200 pixels and the border. So relative to this, that's how we get our dimensions. The fixed one is relative to the viewport, and so that's the main difference between the two. The final one that we are going to be looking at is position sticky, right? And an element with position sticky is positioned based on the user scroll position, right? So a sticky element will sometimes toggle between the two relative and fixed, right? And this depends on the scroll position of the user, right? So if the user is scrolling, it toggles between a fixed or a relative uh, position scroll. So yeah, so we are going to take a look at an example, and that will give us some clarity on this. So I got a good example on the realtoryschools.com, and so this is the example that I got, right? So this is the two divs that I just created. One is a class called sticky, and I've just put in there I am sticky. And the second is just a bunch of paragraphs, just telling you in this example, the sticky element sticks to the top of the page and scroll back and forth using stickiness. And there's some text for enabling scrolling, and we have some lorem code, lorem in there to give it some uh, like default values or some text, right? So if I refresh this, you can see what it is over here. Good. So for noun, I'm just gonna absolute, just gonna comment this out. Good. And so when I refresh it, I just have this. So let's do the styling. So I would have my div dot sticky, and I'm gonna add a position. This should be sticky. I position WebKit sticky, and I put my position sticky. I'm gonna put a top of 0, padding 5 pixel, background color. Let's see this, and a border. I'm gonna set a border of 2 pixel solid uh, green. Okay. So when I refresh it, this is what I get. I get my sticky, which is only the class for I am sticky, right? So just this one is the class for I am sticky, right? So you can see we put the position as sticky, and then top 0, right? And then padding of 5, background color. This is just the styling for it. So if I scroll up and down, you can see that it's only this one that sticks, right? So at that point, when you scroll, it becomes a fixed value, right? A fixed position. And when I keep scrolling up and down, right, it now becomes relative. So that's how it toggles between relative and fixed. I hope that explains it. The CSS overflow property, right, controls what happens when the content is too big to fit an area, right? And so that is what we are going to be looking at. It specifies, sorry, whether to clip off the content or to add scroll bars, right, when the content is actually too big for the specified area. And the values that we are going to be looking at is visible, hidden, scroll, or auto, right? So the first one, visible. So by default, uh, the overflow is visible, which means that the content is not clipped and it renders outside the element box. We just saw that previously where I had to increase the dimension of the box, but that is the default behavior. So this is an example that we are going to look at. Okay, so let's have an example Let's create a div right down here. Good. And I have this div. So if I refresh this, right? Yeah. So I just commented out these other ones that we already did so we can get some space. And then I had this overflow class, right? And then just put in some text in there. And then in the style, I just put a background of light gray and a width and a height and a border so we can see. And I said overflow visible, which is the default, right? So you can see that the content overflowed the container, which is the div, right? And so it didn't clip it off, it just let it overflow, right? So that is what the overflow is. In contrast, if it is hidden, then the content is clipped. So let us change the position. Let's just have the overflow set to hidden. Okay, so we set the overflow to hidden. And if I refresh this, you can see that it clips off the overflowed content. So you don't have that. We can also set the overflow value to scroll. And if it's set to scroll, the overflow is clipped and the scroll bar is added so you can scroll inside the box to see the rest of the content. So let's change that to scroll. Good. So if I refresh this, you can see that it's clipped, all right? But you can scroll to see the rest of the content, right? And then finally, we have the value auto. And the auto is similar to scroll, but what it does is it adds scroll bars only when necessary. So if it's not necessary, you don't see the scroll bar. So I'm just gonna add auto and I'm gonna refresh this, right? So you still see the scroll bar, right? But it only adds the scroll bar if the content is more than the container. If it is not, then the scroll bar does not get added. You can also set overflow in both directions, the X and the Y directions. Overflow X specifies what to do with the left to right edges of the content, right? And overflow Y specifies what to do with the top to bottom edges of the content, right? So, for example, I can have overflow X. I can set this to hidden. Sorry. And I can set overflow Y, and maybe I can set this to scroll, right? So if it overflows in the X direction, it becomes hidden. If it overflows in the Y direction, it becomes scroll, right? So that is how this works. So thank you guys for watching. We have gone way beyond our 10-minute mark. It's now 20 minutes. So I'm going to end here and I'll see you in the next lesson. Thank you. See you. Bye.